Hi everybody. So there were some questions we didn't get to last night in our Canvas class, so I wanted to walk you through this PowerPoint, which I believe we viewed in the fall, and just try to answer some of those remaining questions we had about differentiation. A lot of people had questions about, it's hard, how do I start, what are some examples, do I have to do it every lesson, and the answer is no. You don't have to do it every lesson. Carol Ann Tomlinson, who's written a lot about differentiation, has this quote, begin slowly, but just begin. So that's really what I think you should take away as you're starting to think about this. So some more from Tomlinson, as well as Rick Wormley, who wrote some of the articles on adolescence that you read in the fall. I wrote this in the chat last night, but remember that you can differentiate according to content, process, or product. So a content example would be the one that Veronica brought up, a literature circle. The students are actually reading different texts, right? So they can choose it, or you might help guide them a little bit according to a reading level. So there's a perfect example of content. The process by which students do something. I definitely had students with IEPs or 504s that required that I chunk material in smaller pieces in order for them to access it, whereas I might have not given that same accommodation to all of the students. So that's an example of process differentiation. And then product. It may be that students are actually producing different length of essays, or they're different types of work that they're using to show mastery. I was helping my students, my son's 4th grade class this morning with math, and 2 of the students who work with a special ed aide during the class I saw had actually different exit tickets. They were all working with fractions, but the text on their exit tickets was larger because they both have some visual processing issues, and the questions were more detailed and broken down in different ways. So they actually were doing the same kind of work, but they were producing a slightly different product in the end. And, we often think about differentiation in terms of special ed students, but it also can just be, who's ready, who's interested in the material, who is up for another challenge, and who is still having trouble grasping these concepts. And then learning profile and styles, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So some basic principles that underlie differentiation, we already know. You guys are doing a great job understanding that assessment and instruction are linked. You can't know if somebody learned something unless you assess it. With differentiation, we don't necessarily have to change the difficulty of tasks, but you might, again, have to break things down and change the complexity, making it more or less complex. Also, you don't have to change the quantity, you might change the quality. You know that organizing and planning ahead of time will allow you to be flexible, and sometimes teachers worry that they're giving up autonomy, but you really ultimately have more control if you differentiate effectively. And then, using your students, helping them, getting them involved in their learning and monitoring what's going well and what they still need to work on. Making sure that all the tasks that you're giving are respectful. I think that's just a good guiding principle for any work that you do. And remembering back to that idea of scaffolding, where students are always going to be at slightly different zones of proximal development, where they can be challenged but not be overwhelmed by the difficulty of the task before them. And that's a real balancing act. But keep trying to find that level for each of the students. Speaking again to the issue of how often, maybe you don't need to do it every day. You certainly don't need to do it every day or every lesson. Working at the sense of a week or a unit or a semester is a little less overwhelming. And just remembering that what's equitable, what's fair and just is not always the same for all students. Just like we have students with visual impairments need certain accommodations, or people park in handicapped parking spaces. That doesn't mean that it's not fair and equitable. So how do I start? So just like you would start with anything, with a lesson or a unit, you think about your objectives. What is the content? What are the skills that you want students to master? And then really think about your students. Think of them individually and think of them as a group. What is it that they're going to need in order to support their learning of these objectives? And then again, either for the group or for those that might struggle, think about how you might modify content, process, or product. Develop your assessments accordingly. Develop your instruction to think about how students are going to meet the objectives. Get some feedback from colleagues if you can, especially if you have an inclusion teacher who is someone you can work productively with, and then try it out. So I showed you this grid in the fall with the levels of Bloom's taxonomy and multiple intelligences, and I think that we talked about how there's been some controversy over multiple intelligences, and folks are saying, we don't really just fall into one and it's not scientifically proven. But I think if you read over the descriptors, you'll probably recognize yourself. You'll probably recognize some of the learners that you have in your classroom. And I think it's true that we don't just necessarily fall into one or the other, but I know that when I read these, there are some that I identify with more than others. And then the level of blooms, of course, so lower level things like knowledge and comprehension, and then moving to higher level thinking like synthesis and evaluation. And so the idea of this grid is that over the course of a unit or a semester, you want to try to check as many of these boxes as you can. With English, we tend to be in this linguistic mode quite a bit. So you want to just think about if all of my assessments are written. Can I incorporate something that has to do with music or performance or for bodily kinesthetic or some other activities, even just lesson activities, not necessarily assessments, that could fit in one of these boxes? And I would say you can check off the box if you just do an activity, even if it's not a major assessment. So if you've got everything over here, that's a problem. You want to think about the different levels of knowledge. In Bloom's taxonomy, you have to obviously have some knowledge and comprehension sometimes, that's fine, but you also want to make sure that you're not exclusively doing that and not moving on to the higher levels as well. So that's something that you can use as you plan a unit or plan a marking period. And then finally, one other easy way to differentiate just as a beginning is incorporating choice. So in this example, we've got 3 writing tasks, an essay, a letter, and a wiki page. All of them involve writing, so students are practicing that skill. Here's a series that involves art and music, creating a soundtrack, doing a painting, creating a collage, and here's one with performances, writing a screenplay, a skit, or performing or videotaping a monologue. And so by giving students choice, they can kind of decide what's meaningful to them and what they want to engage with, but you're also making sure that you're hitting different learning styles and also different ways for students to show their mastery, because that's really what it's all about. And then a couple other students had questions about special ed teachers and English language learners, and my main advice for you there is just not to worry too much about this for student teaching. You want to try to reach every student, you want to do the best you can, but just know that you're in a difficult position here where you're in this setting for 14 weeks and you cannot fix all of these problems. You might have a special ed teacher who's doing too much. You might worry about how your English language learners are doing, so certainly try and do the best you can, but don't feel bad if you can't solve the problems. Those of you who are teaching English language learners, I've mentioned to a couple of you that it might be helpful to go back and read that chapter in Grammar Alive if you took English 294 with me or with Ms. Roselle, or I'm not sure if you read it if you had Alvarez, but it's actually, the book is available online, and I think it's chapter 5, and it just has some helpful tips for recognizing patterns of errors that students who speak certain languages might be making, some small strategies up to larger strategies that you can do to help those English language learners achieve in your classroom. But again, just kind of do the best you can. Begin slowly, just begin, as Tomlinson says. And if you have other questions, let me know. We'll continue talking about this semester. Thanks.